Good day, gentlemen and
Good day.
listeners. Welcome.
Good day.
Welcome to this episode in the Chairman of the Boards. With us today, we have the incomparable Ron from RJM, and we're going to be talking all things line mixers. I have with me today a line mixer. If you are viewing this on YouTube, you'll see in my hand, I have this very petite mixer that could fit really anywhere on your pedal board. And for many years, the line mixer was discontinued through RJM only to recently make its way back into the lineup. And we are, of course, excited about that. And so today with Ron, we're going to talk about all things line mixers. And invariably, this is going to get us into wet, dry, wet setups and how to properly use a mixer like this in your pedal board system. I am really excited about this. Thank you, Ron, for being here today with us for Chairman of the Boards.
Sure. Great to be here as always.
So I think before we get started, I think between the four of us, we can maybe break down what is a line mixer, and just to kind of start somebody out with some prior knowledge. Should they not be aware of what this means? What is the basic definition? And maybe Ron, for you, this is the best person to ask. What would you say is the basic definition of a line mixer? I think that's first question. Part two is, and what would be a reason that somebody might need one or want to implement it into their rig?
Okay. Well, I mean, a line mixer is a really simple thing. I mean, literally, it's just taking four inputs and mixing them down into one, output. And, that's, it's actually one of the simplest things we make, but it's, incredibly useful though. And it's like any other mixer that you might use in audio, but it's much trimmed down and simplified compared to any kind of mixing board, of course. But basically, the idea here is to run your effects in parallel. So you're not running your overdrive into chorus, into delay, into reverb. But when you get down to the end of that chain and get the time-based effects, that when you run one into another, you can get interactions between the effect. If you have a lot of delay, a lot of reverb and all that, where you're, delaying your reverb or reverbing your delay and all that. And if you're doing something very effects heavy, instead of running the output of one effect into the input of the next, you actually split the signal so that the dry guitar signal goes into all of your effects inputs at the same time in parallel, and then you take the delayed guitar signal and the reverb guitar signal and what have you, and then mix them down at the end, so you can hear them all, but each effect isn't affecting the other effect. They're just kind of, you can hear them together, but they're not kind of playing off each other, I guess, is the shorter way to say it.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, and it's heavily used. I would say the most common application where we might see this used is in somebody who's trying to create a wet, dry, wet rig. And typically, just to kind of go over what that means, is that you would have a dry cabinet that would be accepting all of your sort of non-time-based effects. So it would be all of your, let's say, overdrives, distortions, compression, equalization, maybe some modulation stuff in front of that, like maybe univibes, flangers, phasers. Those would typically be in front of the amp. But then as far as all of the wet processing effects, the chorus, delays, reverbs, that would typically come out in a classical sense out of a line out of the dry amp, and then would feed maybe a stereo chorus that would be the splitter that would go into the input of the mixer, and then the mixer might incorporate delays and reverbs, maybe pitch shifting. Or in the Bradshaw classic era, the 80s, he would often use two mixers. Have you seen much of that, where he would take the first mixer and have like reverb and pitch, and then that mixer would go in series into another mixer, which would then have delays.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely heard of his earlier rigs and being able to do that kind of stuff, and that's pretty cool. But yeah, it's you can do a lot of things with it. It's all pretty configurable by the users. Whatever the user needs.
Got it. Brian or Grant, any clarifications that you would make to kind of line mixer uses and who you would identify as rig builders as somebody who might be a good fit for such a product?
I think one of the hardest things I have as a rig builder with line mixers is just describing to people without the use of too many diagrams or flowcharts or signal chain, whatever, trying to describe to them what it actually sounds like or the purposes of it, usually on a Zoom call or a phone call or something like that. And the easiest way I've been able to kind of describe to people with these and the pros and cons of them is it's almost like your guitar is plugged into your delay at 100% mix. So you're only getting delay repeats and you play a guitar line. That is, line number or track number 1. Then you play the exact same thing again, plugged into only a reverb at 100% mix. And then you record that and put them on top of each other. So you get one of only delay, one of only reverb, and they're stacked on top of each other in your DAW. Then you play the exact same thing again, just dry guitar. And so you have these 3 duplicate guitar lines, one with 100% delay, one with 100% reverb, one with just dry guitar. And that's kind of where you're headed in this parallel realm. And I think from my perspective, this is neither a better or a worse way to run your rig, but it's an approach to a rig. So I've had customers go fully parallel and they hate it because they're so used to what Ron just described of the delay feeding into their reverb and having that cascading effect. But then I've had other guys, and myself included, who go to this parallel sound, and it just brings all this clarity and separation between your guitar lines in a way that nothing else can. And so I'm a huge fan of line mixers. And 10 years ago, 13, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago when we started, we had the original RJM line mixer in the shop, and that's when we first got into this. And I was just blown away by the sound. And so I, among many other people, my customers as well, are all very excited that the line mixer is back from RJM. There's obviously other ones out there, but I just love the simplicity of how the RJM version brings everything together with some pedalboard friendly approaches to it. So I'd say if you're a guitar player that finds that your delays and reverbs especially, it kind of lends itself to your sound getting a little bit muddy, or it's hard to get some definition out of the notes and the playing, then perhaps running a parallel delay and reverb to start and maybe chorus or some other effects down the line as well. But especially delay and reverb, I think it could be something to really help get some definition. The transients, the pick hitting the string of your guitar, if that's all getting lost, I think going parallel could be something to look into for sure.
Yeah.
Ryan?
Yeah, I agree. I will say I don't get often the request for this type of setup. Typically, if it is, it's excuse me, it's just setting the settings on the RJM PBC10. I get that a lot. Since this box is a newer, on the newer side, I'm excited and hoping that I get more. It's definitely one of those types of things that you can't just dive in. Like, you can't just buy the box and expect to throw it on the board in 5 seconds and it be ready to go. And exactly what, there's some setup that you have to do on your units, and there's just some research to understand and know, because the first time that I played I had the PBC10 and I switched it into parallel mode. I was like, oh, that's different. And I tried playing it and then I didn't like it. So I just held down the foot switch and switched it back, and I like this. So it's very much you have to know if you like it, if that's what you want. if you're so used to having your delays into your reverbs and then you change that, like it takes a little bit getting used to, but there's a lot of people that run it that way. I mean, I just watched so I've been watching a lot of YouTube rundown videos, and a lot of people have them in their racks, and they're like, there's a lot of great aspects and ways to utilize the unit. It's just kind of doing your research, on the unit prior to, to know, is that investment what you want to do?
Yeah. So I want to actually look at some of the literature that is provided by RJM on this. And one thing that I appreciate, just as somebody who is building rigs, is obviously if you're listening to this and not viewing, you won't be able to see, but there are color-coded lines that really explain very thoroughly where the signal path is going on the front of this. So you can very clearly see where each input is going, where the outputs are connected. And the really cool thing about this as well, that I think really separates it from a lot of mixers, is that you have the ability to go stereo out by using TRS cables. And I believe is the input also stereo in, Ron, on this one with TRS?
Yes, the excuse me, the wet inputs are always TRS stereo, and then the dry input, there are the buffer / dry input and output have jumpers on the inside that let you configure for mono in or mono out, and stereo in or stereo out, just so you can adapt to whatever your rig needs.
So it's just a really great way to be able to do it, because you are saving on the number of jacks that you would need. Obviously, if every single one of these was a mono jack, for input left and input right, this would be double the size that it is. So it's actually a great space saving measure as far as the design is concerned. I want to share my screen here quickly, though, because I think some of the basic uses might be best exemplified through a visual here, and we'll do the best that we can to maybe make sure that if you're viewing this or you're listening to this, that we give you an accurate description. But this is the quick start manual, and there's a few different manuals that are associated here, and we'll maybe go through a couple of them. But it just gives a really nice, clear demonstration of kind of where everything is. So I'm going to zoom in maybe a little bit more than we might need to, but we just want to make sure everything is really clear. So on the right side of the unit, you have your dry input, and Ron, you've said that this can go mono or stereo, and you can configure it accordingly by way of a internal jumper, or is it dip switch?
They're internal jumpers that you move.
Great. So super easy. Just all it will require is you opening up the bottom and then reconfiguring the position of those jumpers.
Correct.
And that's for the input of the dry input, and then does that also affect the stereo output of the buffer out and the mixer out, or are those always configured for stereo?
Dry in and buffer out are configurable for mono or stereo, and the wet inputs and the mixer out are always stereo.
Got it. Cool. So you can see you have your mono, you have your dry in, you have your buffered out, and we'll explain why this is important in a moment, and there's some of the demonstrations that show this. You have 3 stereo wet inputs. You have a mixed output that's mixing all 3 wet inputs. Of course, you don't need to use all those wet inputs. If you only have 2 wet effects, you're not required to use all 3. And then you have your dry level, which is adjusting how much of the dry signal that you want involved, and then the wet signal. A quick question on that, Ron, around just from your opinion. A lot of people talk about the idea of running the wet effects, especially in a wet, dry, wet system, as 100% wet with no dry in it whatsoever. Do you have a feeling about that versus involving some dry in the cabinets? It seems to me that the majority of the classic rigs typically didn't have fully wet stereo cabinets. They always had some amount of dry in them. It was rare that you found people doing 100% wet with no dry. Do you have a sense sonically or functionally as to a reason to do one or the other?
Okay, well, first thing I should make sure that people know is that definitely the effects themselves should be 100% wet.
Yeah.
The pedals themselves. Otherwise, you start kind of losing control of your levels and all that, because you'll have, if you have your, reverb plus the dry signal and your delay plus the dry signal and all that, you basically start boosting your level because you kind of keep adding copies of your dry signal together.
Yeah.
But anyway, once you've got your pedal set to 100% wet or kill dry, as some of them call it, then yeah, I mean, there's definitely kind of two schools of thought on that. The nice thing with this line mixer, which is something we didn't have in our previous one, is the wet level and the dry level controls. And so it's super easy to, once you connect this, to basically try it for yourself and see. And generally speaking, you keep the wet level all the way up, but then you can start with the dry level at 0 and then just start turning it up a little bit and see whether you like it or not, and and see basically whether you want any of that, any of the dry signal coming out. But it's much like doing parallel or wet dry wet. It's really a matter of personal preference. But when you do have the nice thing about having the dry level is you do have that immediacy and the transients and all that, and so you get kind of more of that punch, even if you mix in a little bit into the wet cabinets as well.
Yeah.
What I really like about this, which I can't remember off the top of my head, it's been so long, if the original one had this or not, but you can have a rig set up for wet, dry, wet with 3 independent outputs using this box. So you could use the buffered out, which is the yellow line if you're watching, or basically just your dry signal going straight through the box to the other side. Send that to an amp. And then you can send, out to your 2 wet amps as well, with only receiving the wet signal. So tons of separation like we were talking about before. That's great. And that's for, I know Mason, Brian, Ron, you guys can all relate to this. When we're doing our stadium tours, that's probably what we're going to be doing as guitar players. We have 3 amps on stage. Yeah. Okay, good. Just making sure you guys are all on board. Madison Square Gardens next week, when we're all playing there, we're all going to have wet, dry, wet rigs running to 3 independent amps. But then when we're back home in our personal studios and it's a smaller venue, we can blend in the dry with the dry mix knob, and we can run that dry signal to the wet outputs. So now you can run, a stereo rig, but still have some dry mixed in there to your desired level, with your wet effects still in parallel, with the parallel dry signal going to 2 amps or maybe 1 amp. And I love how this box actually allows you to do that, just by turning that potentiometer, which is really handy. So you don't have to, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Ron, but you don't have to, decide today, this is my wet, dry, wet rig, I always need to run 3 amps. You could go back to a bit of a simpler rig by mixing in dry, if that's your preferred way of running it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, you can go down, from 3 to 2 to 1 amp even, if you're, limited. And it's just a matter of just, letting that dry signal into the wet outputs, and then you have that flexibility.
Yeah.
I like that. That's really cool.
I wanted to show just some examples Ron provides here on the website. These are all available at rjmmusic.com. And if you head to the micro line mixer page, these manuals are all a part of what is available to any customer. And he shows a couple of different versions of what's capable, and I think one thing that is worth talking about is sort of the confusion of connection, because I know a lot of people that see the line mixers, they're not quite sure about how they're configured because they only see these inputs for the wet. They don't, and they're like, well, what do I do with the input into the pedal that the output of those pedals is feeding this mixer? So just to give you a visual, what you see here in terms of wet 1, 2, and 3, those are only capturing the outputs of your wet effect. So let's pretend, for example, for this person, this fictitious person, they're using a, Eventide micro pitch, they're using a Strymon Big Sky, and they're using a Eventide H9. They have those three effects. So those are all going stereo into wet 1, 2, and 3. And again, for parallel, just for listeners out there, it does not matter the order. Since it's all in parallel, they're all receiving the same signal at the same time. The order is irrelevant now. So you don't need to have any sort of concerted order in the signal path once these are in the mixers. The challenge, however, is you only have the outputs plugged in. So a lot of people are like, well, what the heck happens to the inputs? What do I do? Is there just some Bluetooth mystery that's getting these in? So Ron shows here an example of what to do. So you can see on the right side here, if you're viewing this, that he has a sort of mocked up Mastermind PBC6X. And the sends are feeding each one of these effects that are wired into the mixer. And this is in essence just to mute the inputs of those effects. So when you want it engaged, you can set your switcher to engage that particular loop, and it's going to be sending effects, those effects into the mixer and making them live. This is different than, if you had them sort of looped into their own send and returns. You don't need to do that for this. The send is coming out of the switcher. The return is going into the mixer, and then the mixer is mixing however many lines are coming into it and then giving you a stereo line out, or a stereo output. Ron, is there anything that you would add or modify about that description in terms of the way that the signal gets to the mixer and the usage of a switcher as a way to mute the inputs only by way of the send, not using the returns?
I should point out one thing, that one of the things that makes this actually work is what the Mastermind PVC does in this case. And if you plug into the send jacks of the return and you leave the returns open, nothing connected to them, then effectively the loops become a splitter. So whatever effects you have in loops 1 through 3, that resultant output then gets fed to send 4, send 5, send 6, and the output in parallel. It kind of becomes a splitter. And so, whatever your prior effects, identical copies of that get sent to the input of your 3 wet effects here, as well as the main output. And so you're kind of, the PVC here is splitting the signal, then it's going in through all the effects, and then the micro line mixer is combining them back down again into one signal to go to your amp or amps. And so that's just one of the key things of how this actually works. And one thing that's also I should mention that's nice about this is because you're not returning the effects back to the switcher, then you get the delay and reverb tail thing where when you switch off, say, loop 4, you're no longer sending your signal to the delay, but the output of the delay continues to go through the mixer and to your amplifier. And so, you might not be getting any new delay generated, but any prior ones will be allowed to trail off without being cut off abruptly, like it would be if you wired it in series.
Mm.
I have to admit that I'm a little bit embarrassed here, Ron. I am an RJM evangelist, as are the other guys. Which I was actually going to ask you.
You see Grant's tattoo.
Exactly. It's not appropriate to show on camera, but it is there.
Take your word for it.
I had no idea that the 6X could be a splitter. Like this, I just assumed, which was, what they say about assuming, and now I feel like I am a bit of a donkey here, because I had no idea that you could actually send 4, 5, and 6, and presumably 1, 2, and 3. I'm not sure, but definitely 4, 5, and 6 in parallel along with the output. this is blowing my mind right now, and it opens up so much. And the reason I'm embarrassed is that this is a hardware thing and not a recent update. So I was like, oh, you recently updated to allow parallel. It's not that. This presumably was like this from the beginning. So this is a really good feature, and I assume this would be the same on the Meg-X as well, correct?
Yeah. All of our switchers do this, and I have a somewhat similar story on that, where our original switcher, the RG16, which is a rack-based switcher that we did in 2007, I just designed it, and just kind of went, just did it, and didn't even think about stuff like that. And then a customer said, "Hey, I'm using this, and I use the sends of these loops, and I'm using them to send to different amps." And it's like, you did what? And I had to like pull out the schematics and actually look, and it's like, oh yeah, I guess it does that. I had no idea. It was just, originally it wasn't even an intentional thing, and it was just sort of a kind of just an artifact of how the loops were designed that it actually did that. And it was much to my surprise, but it's like, but it's such a an amazingly useful feature that it kept it in, and every switcher we've ever made does the same exact things. It's too useful to not have.
Yeah.
I have a question. Unless Mason, you need the
no, please.
So I'm in the same boat as Grant. And you guys sent me this a couple of weeks ago, which I'm very appreciative of, and I look forward to messing with it. I've have been out of the shop for a couple of weeks, so I haven't had time to mess with it. But like looking at the manual, that was actually the thing. I was like looking at it, seeing all the sends on the, like, you're sending it to the units, then to the mixer, and I was super confused by it, because I was like, wait, is this?
Did you not know either?
I didn't know. And
so that's thank God. That makes me feel like less of an idiot.
Well, it's because like I don't get a lot of people asking. Like I'm looking at a 6X, and I'm looking at the micro mixer, and I'm curious, because like it's the same thing as if you plug in a pedal, a send and return into a pedal, but then like you don't plug the outputs of the pedal. Like how is it not like usually, like when you don't plug in the outputs, the return back into the unit, it mutes it, right? So because you're not getting signal back into the unit. Is there like a setting? Because I literally pulled up the editor while you guys are talking. Is there a setting in the editor is there a setting in the editor that you have to do so it splits it, or does it just automatically do it?
That's just a mechanical feature of the jacks. It's basically a half normaled connection, and so it's always going to do that. And actually, if you want to use if you want to implement a mute in one of those jacks, like say you might want to, like, okay, let's say you want to use a loop as a tuner. You want to connect a tuner, but you want it to mute when you turn on the tuner. You actually have to connect the loop send to the tuner input, but you actually have to make a grounded 1/4 inch plug. We're actually just connecting the tip to ground inside the plug, and stick that in the return, and that will actually break the connection, and it won't actually mute unless you do that. And so the jacks are actually just do that by default.
Okay, so in the diagram, you turning on loops 4, 5, and 6. It sounds like a Star Wars movie. But loops 4, 5, and 6, like sending those signals to those loops 1, 2, and 3 won't go out those loops. They'll just go out through. I'm like using my hands. I don't know. You guys can't see it, but it's just too. I'm like making hand motions. No, but like loops 1, 2, and 3 will just go out the master output. I'm assuming. Like looking at the diagram, I mean that it's something new, something I haven't known has always been there. I'm like
like kid in a candy store.
Yeah, I'm kind of geeking out by it now. I'm just like, oh my gosh, now I want to go and try this. But yeah, essentially, so like loops 1, 2, and 3 will just still go out the master output, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. It basically, if there's nothing in the return jack, then the following loop just gets whatever signal is coming from before it. So in that example, the resultant signal of whatever you got turned on from loops 1 through 3, that's all going to work as expected, and then that end result is going to end up going out send 4, send 5, send 6, and the output, and the sends only if those loops are turned on. But it's basically becomes a switchable splitter, I guess, and that's kind of what makes the whole thing just work.
I have a question, a question and kind of a comment on the difference between kill dry and 100% wet that I want to ask and mention after this, Ron, but I want to do an ad first for some of the sponsors that make the podcast possible. So the first company I want to tell you guys about is the Guitar Sanctuary. My normal comment of Brian is there hasn't worked the last few weeks because Brian's been out dealing with some health stuff, but luckily you're back and looking better than ever, I might say, Brian, at the Guitar Sanctuary. And I know the Guitar Sanctuary is a big fan of RJM. We're all a big fan of RJM. Ron, I'm not sure if you're thumbs up or thumbs down on RJM yet, but I can tell.
Depends on the day and what the challenges of the day have been for the business.
Fair enough. But most of the gear that we talk about on Chairman of the Boards is found at the Guitar Sanctuary. And once you get that gear, Brian Omilion himself can set it up for you on a pedalboard setup and get you all set up, pun intended, and you will be grateful that you did. So check out theguitarsanctuary.com for all of your gearing needs. I also wanted to tell you about the Sweetwater Gear Exchange. I've been using this a lot the past few weeks, selling some pedals I haven't touched or even looked at, I'm sad to say, for the last year. So I'm getting rid of them so I can buy some stuff that I'll actually use a little bit more. And the great thing about Sweetwater Gear Exchange is that you can sell your gear and you can select whether you want to keep that money that you just made on a gift card at Sweetwater and say no to all of the fees. So you can basically bypass and save a whole bunch of money if you keep it within the Sweetwater environment, which I've been doing. So I can save up to buy some stuff on Sweetwater. And you can check this out and learn a bit more at sweetwater.com/used. And I think you're going to be really glad that you did it. And the more of you that actually take up my advice, the more gear I get to peruse through. So we're kind of all benefiting each other here. So check out sweetwater.com/used and learn how you can save even more money when you sell your gear. And then lastly, I wanted to tell you guys about monocreators.com. So we are big fans of the soft bags, the backpacks. They now have pedal boards and power supplies along with a few extra accessories, and they just make some of the highest quality gear in the business. The soft bags and backpacks especially, when I think about those from other companies, I usually think about frayed ends and broken zippers and a lack of protection, all of which is not an issue with the mono stuff. So I've had my soft bags for years, and I know Brian, same with the backpacks, and Mason for the double gig bags. They just keep on going. So check out monocreators.com and use the code. Yes, there is a code, Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, if you like saving 10% or getting 90% away from free, as we like to say on Chairman of the Boards. That's monocreators.com. Use the code Chairmen for 10% off. So I want to get back to my question/comment on the difference between kill dry versus 100% wet. So, and Ron, please correct me at any point of this if it's not quite correct here, but I think there is a big difference here and a distinction that needs to be made, because a lot of people will say, oh, I'll just turn up the mix 100% and all the dry disappears. Let's say on like a Boss DD7. This is a perfect example. Kill dry is not available on a Boss DD7 as far as a global menu change. So when we're talking about routing a rig with, let's say, the PBC 6X, like we've just been mentioning, and if we're using a normal splitter, this would work on a PBC 6X, just a normal buffered splitter, and then you turn the DD7 off because it doesn't have kill dry. Now you're just going to pass dry signal through the DD7 as you normally would. Whereas on, let's say, a Strymon timeline, you set it to kill dry, which is 100% wet. and then you turn the timeline off, it mutes that signal. And so that, in my mind, is the really big distinction. There's other things like you turn the mix down on a timeline in kill dry, and it brings the whole delay level down with it all the way to off. So are there any other things that we need to talk about with the difference between kill dry versus 100% wet when you're in a parallel rig? Or did I butcher the explanation? Anything you'd adjust there or inform people about?
Well, I mean, it seems like different manufacturers implement it differently. Like I definitely run into the thing that you mentioned about Strymon pedals. The mix knob becomes effectively just a wet level control or just overall level control, and and then it'll depend on whether the pedal is buffered bypass or true bypass. And I don't think there's any particular standard, from manufacturer to manufacturer on how that's going to be implemented. But because I can't recall any examples off the top of my head, but there probably are pedals that are just completely, there is no difference between 100% wet and kill dry, and it just behaves the same way. But generally speaking, kind of what you said is, when it's kill dry, it's really, it's truly just eliminating the dry signal altogether through the entire pedal. And so whether, setting it 100% wet achieves the same result is going to depend on how the pedal was built, I think.
I have a question, Ron, which selfishly pertains to a rig that I'm building right now. And I'm building a pedal board that is inspired by some of the Nashville standards, and I am using one of the Nashville standards, which is the old Line 6 M9. And I find myself in need of a mixer, and I found that on the M9 that it doesn't have any sort of analog drive-through whatsoever. And I know that some purport that this is not an issue. And I find that it's generally not if you're running the thing just strictly in stereo and in all serial, effects. But when you start to run it in a wet, dry, wet context, and you have a reference now of the actual dry signal that's split separately from it, that latency without a mixer is very noticeable because of the non-analog dry signal path. And you have a specific diagram here, which I think is actually perfectly fits my needs and is in fact how I'm planning to implement the line mixer, which is a little bit different than a standard wet, dry, wet application, kind of like we talked about before. Whereas you can see on this diagram, and I'll describe it to listeners who are not viewing this on YouTube, where you have all your dry effects and overdrives, in essence, coming into the dry input on the mixer, which is on the bottom right. And then you're taking the buffered output and you're creating, I believe in this case, a splitter cable. Is that right, Ron?
Yeah, I mean, if you're skilled enough to make a three-way splitter cable, you can do that, or there are splitter boxes and all that. But whatever it takes to create a passive split, like 1 in and 3 out.
Yeah, and obviously this buffered output has a low enough output impedance where it's going to be able to drive that splitter cable without any issue.
Exactly. That's why we go through. Well, one of the reasons we go through the buffer first is just so that it can handle the split.
Yeah, and so you've got it split, and in my case, I don't even really need to do that for the M9, because I'm just going to take the buffer out. It's going to go into the input of the M9, and then I have the stereo outs of the M9 feeding the mixer. One of the mixer inputs, doesn't matter which one, and then I'm able to reincorporate my dry signal so that I can get rid of that analog or the non-analog drive-through, the DSP bypass that's on it. And I can restore my original analog dry signal that's coming into it. And this way, if I do split it, and I do have the option to do that on my rig where I can run it wet, dry, wet, or I can run it all in series in front of 2 stereo amps, I don't have any consequence of doing that. Now, in the case of this particular effect, I don't know that they actually go 100% wet. I was experimenting with it a bit and trying to see the best way to do it. Since it is always on in some capacity, I seem to be able to get away with not having the effects 100% wet, because I don't believe all of them do or even are capable of going 100% wet on that particular device. Do you have any recommendations based on how I might implement this with my M9 that might optimize it further than what I've already explained?
Well, I mean, you are going to be, if you can't go 100%, you are 100% wet, you are going to run into some limitations on that. And there's one thing that should be mentioned when you're talking about any kind of parallel setup with digital effects, and that is digital effects have latency, and so that basically the signal comes in the input, and maybe a couple of milliseconds later it comes out the output, and that's even if it's a digital dry signal, even the dry signal comes out a little bit later, and in many cases that just doesn't matter at all, and it's all fine. But if you start doing stuff like this, where you're splitting the analog signal and then kind of going around the pedal, and setting up parallel like we've been talking about here, and then mixing it back in with the output of the M9, what you have is a dry signal, and then a dry signal that's coming in a few milliseconds later than the other dry signal, and what does that do? That's a flanger, and so you can actually get a little bit of flanging out of it
for free.
For free. Yes. Whether you like it or not.
Clarify. Free flanging.
And so now, if you're doing time-based effects like delay, reverb, or chorus, it doesn't matter because you're delaying it even more, and so it goes out of the if you're doing a 400 millisecond delay, it doesn't matter whether it's like 400 milliseconds or 402 coming out of there, and so that's fine. But I think it might have even been with the M9 itself, but definitely in early days I found this out the hard way, and certain effects where you were doing non-time based things like the overdrive emulations or things like that, I'm like, why am I getting this kind of weird phasey flangering thing? And that's why. It's just that you're kind of have two slightly out of whack signals being mixed together, and so I can't say that I have optimization tips, but that's definitely a thing that you'll likely run into unless you generally keep to the time-based effects, and it's unfortunately something that's not avoidable in something that doesn't have a true kill dry or 100% wet capability.
But on something, let's say so it's not relegated, and this is again clarification for the listener. If you have something like an Eventide H9, which doesn't have any analog dry, but does have the option for a kill dry, that's fine in that you're replacing the dry signal with the analog dry that's feeding the input of the mixer. Whereas on the M9, there isn't an option for a kill dry, and so you're sort of duplicating two dry signals, one that is slightly latent from the original analog dry signal that's on the input of the mixer.
Yeah, I mean, well, that there is, yeah, I mean, definitely getting rid, having no dry signal coming through the pedal will make the pedal, far more usable than something where you can't avoid that. Now, that said, there still can be problems, and it's going to vary from pedal to pedal on this, and it's definitely going to vary based on the effect that you're using. But it could be things like distortion algorithms, compressor algorithms, things that don't intentionally introduce any additional delay. You can still run into that, but it depends on how much latency there is, and what the effect is. And so it's there isn't like one answer for that, but I guess it's something that people should keep in mind if you're trying to run it in parallel, that not everything is going to work.
Yeah.
Now, not unless, like I said, unless with the safe zone is things like delay and reverb, because as I said, you're intentionally delaying the signal, so it's not going to be.
And I don't know if you guys would agree or not. I don't know if you guys would. I don't know if you guys would agree or not, but I think from my tests as well, if you're going to run anything in parallel, the biggest return on investment is delay and reverb. That's where you're going to notice the biggest difference as far as clarity in your signal, transient notes, all that, the textures and everything coming through. As soon as you run delay and reverb in parallel, you get a very quick return on what it feels like to run effects in parallel. And then you can add in chorus or pitch or whatever else you might want to add in. But those are the ones that I've found make the biggest difference if you want to get the feel for that kind of rig.
Yeah.
For sure.
I have a question for when you split the dry output that go back into the wet effects inputs, because since you can split it, do you have to do a TRS, or is it just like a TS split the 2 or 3 more TSs? Because there's a couple different like splitter cable, like stereo split cables, like the TRS to dual TS. Because I know on the output, I was looking at the manual, the output you can set the mono or stereo. If you're doing a split, does it matter if it's set for mono or stereo?
Well, in this case, the only thing that actually needs to be stereo is the okay. Assuming that you want stereo in the first place,
Sure.
Then basically the effect outputs into the mixer, into the amps, that needs to be stereo. But everything before that, like the connection from the switcher to the effect inputs, and
Mono.
everything, all that can be mono. There's really no reason to be stereo, unless you do things like there's Mason mentioned earlier about using a stereo chorus to split, to create a stereo signal. So that's a different story. But if you're just going from maybe some compressors and overdrives and things like that in the previous switcher loops or earlier in your signal path, that totally can be and should be just mono, and then your stereo is coming from your delays and reverbs and your wet effects.
Yeah, I mean without the switcher. So like without the switcher, like if you're not doing a switcher and you come out of here, you said you could do a split cable. Would it just be a TS to split the 2 more TSs? Because since it's above
it depends on the pedals you're going to, but as long as those pedals can be configured to be mono in, stereo out, then you can just use a total a plain TS Y cable passive splitter box, something like that.
Or you can get one of those HOSA like adapters.
Yeah. As long as it isn't just one,
that would work.
As long as it isn't one of those one of those pedals that doesn't give you stereo output unless you give it a stereo input, then you would need to do some conversion. But otherwise, mono's fine.
And you could also, correct me if I'm wrong, I know you can run all mono wet effects, you can run all stereo wet effects into this line mixer, but if I'm understanding how the hardware works, you could also run like a DM2, an analog delay, if you have a TS cable coming out of the DM2 to a TRS cable going into the mixer, but tip and ring are shorted together. And then you could mix like a mono delay with a stereo reverb being mixed down into the line mixer as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. You would definitely need to do that conversion, like you just said, where you need the wet inputs do need, if you want TRS to come, if you want TRS stereo out of the unit, you need to put TRS stereo into the wet inputs.
Yeah.
And so the TS to TRS converter would need to be there for sure. But then it would be
quite the unit, Ron. I'm
so
excited to get into this thing.
Does that mean that you could essentially use a mono reverb pedal with a stereo delay and when it comes out the mix output, if the reverb is mono, like I have a board, a client, he's like, how do I configure this? I really like this. I was like an MXR reverb, but it's like a mono reverb, but then he has like a Walrus D1 or something that's just stereo. Essentially I could run each of those into the loops, but then the reverb output would be TS into a TRS with the tip and ring connected, and that reverb would essentially go out dual mono, if I'm correct.
Yeah, you'd be putting the same reverb on both the left and right sides, and so you can totally mix things like that, no problem.
That's amazing.
Sorry, listener, as we just kind of nerd out here and figure out how we're going to build our next rig.
I'm literally just, my mind is just being blown by this.
I love
it's just like that solves so many things I'd already have to kind of like, oh well, we could do this. It's cool because as a rig builder, and you guys can attest, like I hate when someone's like, hey, I want to do this, and they're stuck on it. And I'm like, well, I hate always recommending something that they have to buy, like a new reverb, when they really love that reverb, but they really want this stereo option. So a box like this that's affordable, that you can keep that favorite, say, holy grail reverb that you have, where you have stereo delays that you've wanted to use and stuff, and you've had that since your grandfather gave it to you when you were 5 years old. I don't know, something like that. Like you've had it a long time. With this simple box,
Grandma gave it to you.
That. Grandma, grandpa, someone, whoever gave it. I built it back when I was a kid. You know what I'm saying is like the fact that you can still implement that box with newer of like a timeline or an H90 or something is really cool. So I'm just like already giddy the mess with
and
it.
I think one other thing that's worth mentioning here, a question I get, which sounds obvious maybe to some people but not to others, is that a common question I get is, I have that in Brian's example, I have the Holy Grail reverb, I want it after my stereo timeline, I want a stereo signal path, can I do it? And essentially the short answer is, in series you cannot. With parallel you can. And so you can, obviously they won't interact the same way, but the short answer is you get kind of some more flexibility in these areas as well, which is great. So I want to, obviously we're going to keep chatting about this. I want to throw to Mason for our final ad today, and then we'll get back into line mixing with Ron.
Yes. Well, I would like to talk about strings, and as many of you know, I have the most corrosive hands on earth. I'm undefeated, at least in my world, as far as most corrosive. And this can be a real curse as it comes to guitar strings, because first of all, nobody wants to let you play their guitar. But secondly, I would ordinarily be relegated to changing my strings on a daily basis should I be using just the over-the-counter stuff. But luckily, I found Stringjoy. And not only does Stringjoy offer coated strings for those of you that are inclined to use them, they also offer a myriad of non-coated strings that I happen to be able to use because they are built of superior metals, handmade in Nashville, Tennessee. And man, I have to say, it's the first time that I've been able to use non-coated strings and have longevity where I can use those strings for a full week without needing to replace them. And then if I even want to extend the life further than that for maybe guitars I don't play so often, I can use the coated variations and get that same amount of longevity that I would find from any of the other brands' coated strings, but I get the playability of an uncoated string, which I absolutely love. And the cool thing about our friends at Stringjoy is they are offering our listeners 10% off of any of the strings that they see on their website, and that includes subscription services, which they offer, where you can get strings delivered to your door at whatever cadence you want. Maybe it's a pack a week. Maybe it's 4 packs a week for all the different guitars and instruments that you're playing. Absolutely amazing strings. Highly recommended. Head over to stringjoy.com. Get 10% off using the coupon code BOARDS, BOARDS, and tell them the chairman sent you. And I'm going to send over to Brian for our final sponsor of the day.
Sorry guys, my whole screen was frozen. Were you talking to me?
Yes.
I'm
I was sending it over to
sorry.
you, Brian, for the final sponsor of the day.
Well, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, you were frozen for a good 20 seconds. Yeah, no, our final one of, I would say, they're one of my favorites. They're the best. Is Bestronics. Is Brad and the guys over at BTPA. They have it all. They're kind of like, as you would say, the Toys R Us of
Nice.
guitar equipment stuff. Even the Toys R Us did go out of business. I did hear a rumor that they might have some stores back, which would be interesting. But I would say they are definitely on the top list of resources you can go to get stuff. There's all sorts of websites, and that's the thing with buying equipment and buying stuff online is that you can't, you don't know the quality of the plugs, you don't know the quality of the cable. It's such a gamble, especially online, and the hassle of returns and stuff. But Bestronics simply carries the best stuff. They really, truly do. Brad and them are so quick to answer the phones or emails. Even on vacation, they'll send me emails back on a simple question I have, and they have a discount code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off. Go check them out. Go on their website. They have all sorts of cables, plugs, looms, racks. They do everything. Check them out, and you won't be mad. And I'll throw it back to you, Mason.
All right. Well, Ron, I wanna take us home on a few more things that this particular unit is capable of. First of all, just to plug the product again, this is available over on the RJM website, and you can check it out right here. I'm on the website now. It's rjmmusic.com/micro-line-mixer. There is a buy now option right down here in the corner. Ron, what's the going rate for a microline mixer these days?
I believe that's $149.
$149. So imagine this is $150, let's say,
Is that in
away
yen?
from free. That's in yen. You can do the conversion if you want to do it for whatever dollar you're using in your native country. But I feel like this is an incredible deal for what it is. It has the high quality buffers that you would find in any RJM product. It has got the masterful mixing of the great Ron Menelli. And I just think that, man, I'm so excited about this. You can use it with your switcher. You could also actually use this with a true bypass looper if you wanted to have those sends. Now, you wouldn't have the option, like you would on the PBC 6X to be able to have all of the prior effects route into those. But if you were just using it strictly for mutes, you could use a true bypass looper for this as well, right? Just to mute those inputs, Ron?
Yeah. I mean, you can, it depends, you have to make sure that it can do the same thing where you can, the loops kind of become splitters, and that depends on how the switcher is wired. But
Sure.
I'm sure many of them will be able to do that.
Can the Mag X? Can you deal with the Mag X too?
Oh yeah. Yeah. All our stuff does
I
the
figured
same, the same trick.
Oh,
Come on,
Yeah.
Brian.
Come on.
Amateur
Yeah.
over here.
Like I said,
Yeah.
once I figured out that that trick, then it's like, oh yeah, we're always going to do that from here on out because it's too cool.
Awesome.
Now, Ron, on the switchers, if somebody, let's say, were inclined, like I'll go back to let me maybe look at one of these other examples that you have on the website of configurations of the particular effects. If I wanted to say use the insert input or send and return, and I wanted to use this to feed the amp directly, and then use the line out to come back in. So, for example, let's say that effects 1, 2, and 3 were all dry effects. Let's say a compressor, an overdrive, and a distortion pedal. And then I moved in terms of the internal software for the PBC 6X, which would allow me to move this loop. And I wanted to move it between 1 through 3 and 4 through 6. Could I use the insert send as the output to the front of the amp and then take a line out of that, and then come back into the return of the insert, and then have 4, 5, and 6, or have 4, 5, and 6 just be feeding the mutes for the or the input mutes for the wet effects, let's say. So in essence, I can use one of the insert loops as my output to the front of the amp. The line out can come in. I guess the line out would just feed the buffer input from at that point in the line mixer, and then you would just be using those sends as the ways to mute the wet effects, and then the mixer output would just feed the power amp or something like that, or of whatever the wet cabinets were. Would that work as well?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, basically, I mean, yes, you can definitely adjust the order so that the insert loop is between loops 3 and 4, and as you say, the insert send would go to the front of the amp. You would need the line out of the amplifier to go back to the insert return, because you need that signal to be able to feed the
inputs,
send 4, 5, and 6.
Yep.
And so basically, yeah, you would be getting that amp signal into insert return. Then that would selectively.
And would you just use a splitter at that point, like a splitter cable that would then feed also the dry input, so you'd have that feeding the mixer as well?
Actually, that's we're back to my cool trick, that one weird trick that basically it's still going to be wired as shown here. So basically, the dry input is still getting the signal from the output jack, because that insert return. Yes.
Yeah.
The insert return of the 6X is getting the amp signal, and then because there's nothing going into returns 4, 5, and 6, then that signal coming into insert return is being split internally by the PVC6X, and it is going to send 4, send 5, send 6, and the output. And so the only thing that would change from this diagram is that insert send goes to the front of the amp, and then insert line output of the amp goes to insert return, and then the mix output then goes to your wet amplifiers.
That's so cool. That's so cool.
That's awesome.
And if it didn't, and if let's say somebody was using a switcher that's not RJM for this, not that they would do anything so perverse, but if they were,
how dare,
they could just set or designate a loop in their switcher. Let's say, or like if we were using the PVC-10, which doesn't have the movable loops, couldn't we just assign one of the loops or one of the insert, like the hardwired insert points in there, just to be that output to the amp, and then the return back from the line out?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, the only difference between the insert loop on the PVC6X and the other loops is that it has an integrated buffer on the send, and so basically any way you can get a patch point in there where you have a send and return, any loop, or as you say, the fixed insert points on the PVC-10, anything like that. As long as you can get the signal in and out at a point, you can use that to
that's so great.
To go back and forth to your amp.
It's such a functional tool.
Sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mason.
No, go for it. Cut away.
I was just gonna say, but with this, so like with this box, like you don't even need to use this with a PVC-10, because the PVC-10 has parallel inserts, the option, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only difference is that these have the pots.
I think as of 2023, correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, there's literally that line mixer just Velcroed inside the PVC-10, right?
Yeah, I know. I think.
Kidding, guys. Totally kidding.
Yeah. A little easier to make it the way we do it. Although the first thing would kind of give us sort of a nice DIY vibe that would be kind of fun.
And I think if the last 5 minutes or so, because I know without diagrams it can be hard to understand what we're saying. Mason, can you tell us what page in the line mixer manual you had up on screen for those that are on podcast if they want to reference it later?
So what I'm looking at here, and let me pull this back up so that everybody can see exactly where it is that I'm looking. So all I'm doing is I'm going to the main line mixer page, which is rjmusic.com/micro-line-mixer. And it brings you here, and it shows these beautiful photographs. But then as you're scrolling down, you'll see a little tab that says documentation. And there is the quick start manual. And then there are additional manuals that show specific configurations. So, implementing with the PBC6X in parallel, or with a Mastermind PBC6X, or with the Mini Effects Gizmo X parallel configuration. So you have several different adaptations that will show you different implementations. And then if none of those work, then of course you can always contact Ron and Sherry over at RJM, who I would say arguably have the best customer service in the business, and they will certainly take care of you.
Love it.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts, gentlemen, before we complete with our mixing genius, Ron from RJM?
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like I came in here, Ron, feeling like I really understood what this box can do. And it did everything I thought that the box could do. But then you've also just blown my mind on how to integrate this with other products as well. So I'm very happy with the result of this podcast. I'm going to be able to try some of this stuff out on a whole different playing field now with my own stuff. This is going to be great. So all that to say, thank you for your time today and for blowing our minds.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I appreciate being on here because it's such a simple thing, but it's the applications can be complicated, or at least it's not immediately obvious what you do with it, I guess. Yeah. And so, just be able to, work through this, I guess, and kind of explain to people has been, I think, really, I think has been very helpful for sure.
Yeah. As someone that this is new, like this product is new on the market, it's sometimes hard to wrap your head around. I'm such hands-on, watching YouTube's tutorials. Heck, my favorite type of show to watch is documentaries. Like, I just love details. I love watching. So hearing, watching if you're watching online, and seeing these diagrams on how this box works really makes me excited to recommend it, because a lot of times people will be like, oh, you guys work with pedal boards and pedals, you already know how to work everything. A new pedal just dropped 5 seconds ago, you know how to use it, which is not always the case. But having the opportunity to sit down and talk to you and really understand really makes me excited for it, because it can do so much stuff. It literally just solved the issue I was having for a rig build that I'm in the middle of quoting. Like, I don't have to go and research or have anything custom made to do this type of thing, because it's literally done and it's $149. So thank you for making such a great box and such great products. I've been using and selling them for years. Ever since I started building, I've been using them, and the micro mixer is great. The multi-box, everything that you guys have are just phenomenal. So bravo.
Thanks. You, Ron.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. We're gonna have to get. I know we have our Saint Bob shirt, which is the patron saint of the rack, but maybe we're gonna have to get a Saint Ron shirt, patron saint of the switcher.
Yep.
Yeah.
/ mixer.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, Ron, thank you again so much for being here. And we will have the Microline mixer listed in the show notes in addition to the description if you're interested in it. And that way you can research more. Again, it's $149. And I think it's an incredible price for what it does. I challenge anybody even just to find a high quality buffer that is at the level of the RJM microline mixer that is at that price point, because you won't find it made in the USA right down in Southern California in San Diego County. And just can't appreciate you enough, Ron, for all the things that you do, and your lovely wife, Sherry, for all the things that she does. Thank you guys for just making the industry better and creating such wonderful products.
Thanks, guys. It's been fun. It's always good to be on.
All right. Well, until next time, we will strap back into the Miata. We'll put Ron back there on top of the roll bar, and we'll make our way a little bit further on our way down to Tone Town. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Yep.
Yes.